Hello students, welcome to Educate. Today we'll be going on with the third part of the fourth chapter of class 12th NCERT History और उस चैप्टर का नाम था Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings. So up until now we have studied about Hinayana, Mahayana Buddhism, स्तूपास का जो स्ट्रक्चर होता था वो कैसा होता था, बुद्धिस्ट फिलोसफीज, भिक्खूज भिक्खुनीज रूल्स फॉर मंक्स, उनके लिए क्या रूल्स और रेगुलेशंस होते थे, एंड द न्यू फॉर्म ऑफ बुद्धिज्म हाउ इट वाज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम हिनायाना और द इनर और कोर साइकिल. नाउ वी विल बी मूविंग ऑन विद द चैप्टर फर्दर, जिसमें की बात होती है द ग्रोथ ऑफ पुराणिक हिंदुइज्म. नाउ जो पुराण थे, जो आज की डेट में हम देखते हैं स्कंद पुराण, विष्णु पुराण, गरुड़ पुराण, ये इस टाइम में और एक पर्टिकुलर फेज में कंपाइल किए गए थे, लिखे गए थे. दे आर डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द वेदास. हाउएवर इनकी जो फिलोसफीज हैं वो वैदिक लिटरेचर से और वैदिक कंसेप्ट ऑफ रिलीजन, गॉड एंड हायर पावर से इंस्पायर्ड भी है. सो ग्रोथ ऑफ पुराणिक हिंदुइज्म. As of now, the notion of savior was not unique to Buddhism. We find similar ideas being developed in different ways within traditions that we now consider a part of Hinduism. Savior. देखिए, जो earlier Hinduism था वो different था और अब जो आ रहा था वो different था. Puranic way of worship was different from the Vedic way of worshipping. These included Vaishnavism, a form of Hinduism within which Vishnu was worshipped as principal deity, and Shaivism, a tradition within which Devadidev Mahadev Shiv was regarded as the chief god, in which there was growing emphasis on the worship of a chosen deity. एक ही deity को पकड़ना है और उसको ही supreme मानना है. In such worship, the bond between the devotee and the god was visualized as one love and devotion or bhakti. More on emotions. Emotions पे emphasis ज़्यादा दिया जाने लग गया था. In the case of Vaishnavism, cults developed around the various avatars or incarnations of the deity. 10 avatars were recognized within the tradition. These were forms that the deity was believed to have assumed in order to save the world whenever it was threatened by disorder and destruction before the dominance of evil forces. It is likely that different avatars were popular in different parts of the country. Recognizing each of these local deities as a form of Vishnu was one way of creating a more unified religious tradition. Dashavatar of Vishnu, Matsya, Vara, Vaman, Kachap, and then you had Parshuram, Ram, Narsingh, and Kalki. Shiv mein we had Veerbhadra, Piplad, Nandi, Bhairav, Ashwathama. Then there was Rishi Durvasa, Hanuman, Sharba, Grihpati, Krishna Darshan, Avdut, Sureshwar, Kirat, Brahmachari, and Yaksh. Nandi was also there. And so ये सारे अवतार्स और इनकारनेशंस बताए गए हैं रिस्पेक्टिव डेटीज के. शिव के 11 अवतार एंड वन ऑफ हिज रुद्र फॉर्म्स 11 रुद्र, उनके बारे में ऋग्वेद में ही हमें मेंशन मिलता है, विच इज बेसिकली कपाली, पिंगाल, भीम, वीरूपक्ष, विलोहित, षष्ठ, अजपाद, अहिबुदन्य, भवचंड एंड शंभु. सो आगे जाकर के हम इनके बारे में भी पढ़ते हैं. सम ऑफ दीज फॉर्म्स वर रिप्रेजेंटेड इन स्कल्पचर्स एज वी सी अदर डेटीज. शिवा फॉर इंस्टेंस वाज सिंबलाइज्ड बाय लिंगा एज मेंशन्ड इन द पुराण. प्रधानम प्रकृतिर यदाहुर्लिंगोत्तम. All right, basically the linga being the most sacred and pure form of the divine. By the way, let me tell you this, the worship of the linga is even before the Vedic civilization. किसी को नहीं पता शिव का जो लिंगा है, जो basically although he was occasionally represented in human form too, kind of like a phallus shaped, symbolizing the unity of the divine feminine with the divine masculine, the shivling and the yoni. सबसे ज्यादा एंशिएंट फॉर्म ऑफ वर्शिप बताया गया था. All such representations depicted a complex set of ideas about the deities and their attributes through symbols such as headdresses, ornaments, and ayudhas. weapons or auspicious objects the deities hold in their hands and how they are seated. For example, Bhairav holds the most fierce form of Shiva. He holds Pash Khadg, which is basically a Pash is like a controlling stick used for elephants. And also at the same time, Khadg, which is a sacred sword, so on and so forth. Excuse me. We have to be familiar with the stories behind them, many of which are contained in the Purans compiled by Brahmins. By about the middle of the first millennium, Common Era, they contained much that had been composed and had been circulated for centuries. Including stories about gods and goddesses, generally they were written in Sanskrit verses and were meant to be read out aloud for everybody, including women and Shudras who did not have access to Vedic learning. So Puranic literature, different from the hardcore principles of the Veda, that it was open for everyone, an emotion of love and connection towards the respective deity was also seen. Much of what is contained in the Purans evolved through interaction amongst people, priests, merchants, and ordinary men and women who traveled from place to place sharing ideas and beliefs. बेसिकली उस टाइम पे जो डिफरेंट ट्रैवलर्स होते थे, अलग अलग जगहों से आते थे, वो अपने अपने रिस्पेक्टिव डेटीज के बारे में, फॉर एग्जाम्पल इफ देयर इज अ ट्रैवलर फ्रॉम केदारनाथ एंड ही मीट्स अ ट्रैवलर हु इज फ्रॉम basically we can say some Vaishnav site, so they whenever they used to come together, they used to converse and have a religious discourse which led to the development of religious philosophies further on. Also, priests, merchants, ordinary men and women. All right. We know, for instance, that Vasudev Krishna was an important deity in the Mathura region. Over centuries, his worship spread on other parts of the country as well. Krishna, as seen here, सिर्फ एक लोकल डेटी होते थे, लेकिन धीरे धीरे क्योंकि फेमस होने लग गए, सो पूरे इंडिया में इनकी वर्शिप स्टार्ट हो गई. Building temples. Around the time the stupas at sites such as Sanchi were acquiring their present form, the first temples to house images of gods and goddesses were also being built. The early temple was a small square room known as the Garbhagriha. Small square room जहाँ पे idol रखते थे, जो worship होता था, गर्भगृह, with a single doorway for the worshipper. एक जगह आने के लिए जिससे कि जो दर्शन करने आए वो दर्शन करके वहीं से वापस जा भी सके. With a single doorway to enter and offer worship to the image. Gradually, a tall structure known as Shikhara was built over the central shrine. Temple walls were often decorated with sculpture. Later, temples became far more elaborate, with assembly halls, huge walls and gateways, and arrangements for supplying water. ये सारी चीजें भी एक टेम्पल प्रेमिसेस में होती थी. Assembly hall and बड़ी दीवारें, gateways, arrangements for supplying water बाकी जगहों के लिए. Temple in Devgarh, Uttar Pradesh, a very ancient temple as we can see here, but destroyed by the invaders. All right. Okay, one of the idols of Vishnu, which was broken by invaders, and the powerless idol remaining there still sits. Of these were constructed in the 3rd century BC on the orders of Ashoka for renouncers of the world. All right, Ashoka the Great ने basically आजीविका सेक्ट के लिए एक कंस्ट्रक्शन बनवाई थी. This tradition evolved through various stages and culminated much later in the 8th century in the carving out of an entire temple, that of Kailash Nath, of Shiv. So, for Mahadev Shiv, एक टेम्पल है जो आज तक मिस्ट्री है कि कैसे बनाया गया, because it has been carved out of a single rock. Still baffles historians, archaeologists, and Nobody knows the exact scientific explanation to this phenomenon. All right. Can we see everything? By now, we have had a glimpse of such rich visual representations and sculptures, etc. Now we'll move on with grappling with the unfamiliar. It will be useful to recall that when 19th century, European scholars first saw some of the sculptures of gods and goddesses, they could not understand what these were about. Sometimes they were horrified by what seemed to them as grotesque. उनके कल्चर से बहुत डिफरेंट था, डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द फिलोसफीज ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी, सो बहुत ज्यादा इंटिमिडेट भी हो गए थे एंड दे थॉट दे वर ग्रोटेस्क. Figures with multiple arms and heads or with combinations of human and animal forms, basically kind of like a demonic connotation was given to such places by early European, we can say archaeologists, historians, or thinkers, philosophers, etc. These early scholars tried to make sense of what appeared to be strange images by comparing them with sculpture with which they were familiar, that from ancient Greece. While they often found early Indian sculpture inferior to the works of Greek artists, they were very excited when they discovered images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that were evidently based on Greek models. These were more often than not found in northwest in cities such as Takshila and Peshawar, where Indo-Greek rulers had established kingdoms in the 2nd century BCE. That time, Mauryan Empire and the dialogue with the Greeks can also be seen, और उस टाइम पे बुद्धिज्म का prevalence भी हमें देखने को मिलता है. As these images were closest to the Greek statues scholars were familiar with, they were considered to be the best examples of Indian art. In effect, these scholars adopted a strategy we all frequently use, devising yardsticks derived from the familiar to make sense of the unfamiliar. इसके बारे में नहीं पता, उसके बारे में scholars एक common pattern notice करके between sculptures and different religious places of worship or pilgrimage sites, a conclusion is drawn. If text and image do not match. Consider another problem. We have seen the art historians often draw upon textual traditions to understand the meaning of sculptures. अब sculptures का कुछ meaning होता है, कभी कभी वो philosophy से या फिर जो historians consider करना चाह रहे हैं उससे different भी हो सकता है. While this is certainly a far more efficacious strategy than comparing Indian images with Greek statues, it is not always easy to use. One of the most intriguing examples of this is a famous sculpture along a huge rock surface in Mahabalipuram in Tamil Nadu. Clearly, figure 4.30 is a vivid depiction of a story. But which story is it? Art historians have searched through the Purans to identify it, and they are sharply divided in their opinions. Some feel that this depicts the descent of Ganga from heaven. Natural cleft through the center of this rock surface might represent the river. The story itself is narrated in the Purans and the epics. Others feel that it represents a story from the Mahabharata, Arjun doing penance on the river bank in order to acquire alms, pointing to the central figure of an ascetic. Now, अब ये जो confusion है, for example ये जो गंगा का स्टैचू था महाबलीपुरम में, इसको लेके confusion बहुत है. Maybe it describes the descent of Ganga या फिर अर्जुन की स्टोरी बताना चाह रहे हैं. So, we come towards the end of the chapter. Before everything, as I keep emphasizing more and more, we need to look at major religious developments, and the timeline must be clear to us in a very crystal manner so that the entire chapter we understand better and it moves as if it's a story or a series that you watch on television or any electronic devices. पहले early Vedic traditions 1500 to 1000 BC ऋग वेदा कंपाइल हुई थी. 1000 to 500 CE later Vedic traditions, बाकी वेद भी आए थे. 6th century BC Upanishad, Jainism and Buddhism. 3rd century पहले स्तूपा इरेक्ट करे गए थे, रिलीजियस प्लेसेस ऑफ वर्शिप फॉर बुद्धिस्ट्स फॉर अटेनिंग एनलाइटनमेंट, as mentioned in the Sutta Pitaka, and also containing the relics of the Buddha. 2nd century BC onwards, development of Mahayana Buddhism, the outer or the higher cycle, which emphasized on the worshipping of bodhisattvas, idols, and basically looking at the Buddha as a heroic figure for salvation or nirvana. Vaishnavism and Shaivism and goddess cults. Shaktism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism. Shaktism is basically worshipping the divine feminine energy only as being the supreme one in this universe. Alright, then in the 3rd century Common Era, we see the earliest temples. Okay, timeline 2, more detailed. Monuments and sculptures. 1814, founding of the Museum of Calcutta, this and that, all the different archaeological developments can be seen here. Moving on. So now we move to the questions and answers. Were the ideas of the Upanishadic thinkers different from those of the fatalists and materialists? Give reasons for your answer. Okay, as mentioned in the Chandogya Upanishad, it talks about morality, moral values, and explains the Vedas in a simplistic manner. It dives deep into the core principles or philosophies of what the Vedas are trying to teach us. Sometimes moving away from the sacrifices, rituals, or traditions as prescribed in the most orthodox manner in the Vedic Brahmans and also Upvedas. Along with that, because Upanishads are considered as Vedants, the ending of the Veda or summarized it, they try to explain us the deeper meaning of life and what the Vedas are trying to signify. In our day-to-day life में हम उसको कैसे inculcate करेंगे, वो समझना जरूरी है. For example, if we look at the concept of evil in the Vedas, the Upanishads try to explain it to us in a way that जो evil है वो बाहर बताना इसलिए जरूरी समझा है ताकि हमें अच्छे से समझ आए, so that we can understand. Otherwise, the evil that is being mentioned in the Vedic scriptures resides in us. We have to kill the evil within. So it dives deeper into understanding the moral principles that the Vedas are trying to convey from their respective stories or whatever instructions that they provide. Summarize the central teachings of Jainism. So the central teachings of Jainism, basically as described by Mahavir, and Mahavir had laid down different norms for people or the ones following Jainism, that sannyas was an inevitable path and detaching oneself from the society, and at the same time holding no property, not hurting any animal, being truthful, being honest, not to steal. These were the core principles of Jainism. उसके साथ ही उनका जो हिंदी टर्मिनोलॉजी है जो साथ में दे रखा था about dukh, sannyas and moksha, etc., and also renouncing the world must also be written in this answer. Discuss the role of Begums of Bhopal in preserving the stupa at Sanchi. So the Begum Jahan of Bhopal had invested a lot of money for the preservation of the stupa at Sanchi, and thankfully it was to her efforts that the stupa eventually got saved, and as it was being planned by the Englishmen and the Frenchmen to be taken into their respective homes, and they wanted it to take it there because they considered it to be a very intrinsic and an extremely artistic creation done by the ancient people. So what we can see here is that the role of the Begums of Bhopal was extremely important. How? Because it helped in the preservation of the stupa at Sanchi and was retained there and still stays there at the moment, especially the eastern gateway. All right. So, read the short inscription and answer. Okay. In the year 33 of the Maharaja Vishka, a Kushana ruler, जो Kushana dynasty आई थी, which came from the northwestern part of the subcontinent, present day Central Asia, parts of Central Asia, and near the Hindu Kush mountains. In the first month of the hot season of the 8th day, a bodhisattva was set up at Madhuvanak by the Bhikkhuni Dhanavati, the sister's daughter of the Bhikkhuni. Bodhimata, who knows the Tripitaka, the female pupil of the Bhikkhu Bala, who knows the Tripitaka together with her father and her mother. How did Dhanavati date her inscription? So basically, first month of the hot season of the 8th day. From what we can see, सांची स्तूपा में वो लूनर कैलेंडर या फिर एक तरीके से कह सकते हैं जो ट्रेडिशनल पंचांग था उससे हट करके सोलर एनर्जीज एंड द एनर्जीज ऑफ द सन एंड ऑल्सो कैलकुलेटिंग द टाइम अकॉर्डिंगली, we can see that she dates an inscription based on the movement of the sun. All right. Why do you think she installed an image of the Bodhisattva? Because apparently the part of Buddhism which dealt with image worship or worshipping Buddha as a savior was the Mahayana form of Buddhism or the higher cycle. All right. Who were the relatives she mentioned? So, the relatives that she mentions are the sister's daughter of the Bhikkhuni Buddhimata, who knows the Tripitaka. Alright? The female pupil of the Bhikkhu Bala, who knows the Tripitaka together with her father and mother. What Buddhist text did she know? The Tripitaka. Abhidhamma Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, and all the three Pitakas she knows. और पिताका का मतलब ये होता है that 3 baskets of flowers or beautiful things. So from whom did she learn this text? She learned this text from Bhikkhu Bala, all right, who herself knew the Tripitaka together with her father and her mother. Why do you think women and men joined the Sangha? Now, women and men joined the Sangha because, firstly, Buddhism directly dived upon the core philosophies or the depths of the reality of this universe, which the Vedas did during the end in their summary or in the Upanishads. Upanishad भी थोड़े बाद में compile करे गए थे through sages, mainly 7 sages are mentioned. Jaimini being one of them, but Jamdagni, Bhardwaj, Gautam, Atri, Vasisht, Kashyap and Vishwamitra. Also many different sages had also attributed mainly Ved Vyas as well, जिन्होंने Upanishads को एक बहुत ज़्यादा emphasis और importance दी जिसकी वजह से Upanishad compile करे गए. And because Buddhism had the upper hand, being free from all the rituals and we can say traditions or sacrifices, because for a common person, even for a king, एक राजा के लिए भी बहुत मुश्किल हो जाता था प्रॉपर तरीके से वैदिक स्क्रिप्चर्स को फॉलो करना, because of how complicated and difficult they were. Buddhism on the other hand was way easier, focused on karma एंड अपने आप के कर्म को ठीक करने की बात करना और ये सारी चीजों में बहुत ज्यादा एम्फोसिस दिया करता था. ऑल्सो व्हाट वी कैन सी इज कि जो बाय बर्थ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन थी विच वॉज देयर इन द वेदास, एज मेंशन्ड इन द पुरुष सूक्त, ब्राह्मणस्य मुख्यमनसीत् बाहुराजन्यकृता उरुतस्य मध्वेश्वर्यम पाद्भ्याम शूद्रो जायत. signifying a difference between the classes, the castes or the varnas, being inherently by birth, and how they cannot be changed, and they were also based on the occupation that one did. Primarily, it was based on birth. Therefore, people considered to join the Sangha and to basically renounce worldly desires and pleasures. And as this philosophy was very new to that particular point in time, a lot of people, both men and women, could join the Sangha. And it was initially that women weren't allowed, but after Ananda, who stood beside the Buddha while he was on his deathbed, during his final moments, the Buddha had also revealed it to her what he wants. And while he was alive, Ananda requested Buddha to basically allow women to be admitted into the Sangha. और Vedic rituals में and Vedic traditions में, ancient Vedic traditions में, this was not allowed. Women were excluded, Shudras were excluded, and here the equality before nature or the Supreme was seen. Therefore, it gained more popularity over time. Okay, to what extent does the knowledge of Buddhist literature help us in understanding the sculpture at Sanchi? So, जो stupas थे, according to the archaeologists and Buddhist scriptures, what it symbolizes a higher plane or an anda, according to the Sanskrit word, a semicircular dome form. उसके अंदर रखा जाता था, and the way in which the circling was done around the stupa, keeping it to the right hand side and moving in a clockwise manner, entering from the eastern gate of the premises and finishing and going back, symbolized a full cycle of the sun out in the space. So, along with that, the sculpture of Maya, or at the gates, where we can see a goddess who was also mentioned in the Vedic literature, who can bear fruits by touching the trees by her hands, is also seen there, and different interpretations around it. And the knowledge of Buddhist literature also help us in identifying and understanding what the stupa actually meant in reality for the Buddhist followers. Moving on, discuss the development in sculpture and architecture associated with the rise of Vaishnavism and Shaivism. क्योंकि काफी सारी जगहों पे बुद्धा को डायरेक्टली डिपिक्ट नहीं किया गया, थ्रू सिंबल्स किया गया. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, हिम अटेनिंग सैल्वेशन और अटेनिंग एनलाइटनमेंट was at Bodh Gaya, और एक जो स्कल्पचर था उसमें सिर्फ बोध गया का ट्री था. And at one place of one of the carvings, Buddha has been depicted as a stupa and the other as the wheel or a chakra, symbolizing the cycle of birth and rebirth. Therefore, we can say that इस टाइम पे जो वैष्णविज्म और शैविज्म की फिलॉसफी आई थी, इसने बहुत हीरोइक तरीके से स्कल्पचर्स दिखाने शुरू करे, depicting new sculptures of both Vishnu and Shiva, along with, for example, we have seen the depiction of Shiva killing Narsingha, a very ancient temple in southern India, and many different temples depicting Shiva with a trident, blessing everyone with the Abhimudra. New carvings were made along with the goddess Parvati, and also many sculptures of Vishnu, Krishna and Ram depicting scenes from the Mahabharata and the Puranic epics. For example, Vishnu lifting up the entire planet on his kind of like tusks when he took the incarnation of Varaha, or a wild boar, in order to save the earth from evil forces. That's where we see more and more idols being built around temples, and more such idols being worshipped as well at the same time. Parallelly, the growth of Mahayana Buddhism as well, which emphasized on the worship of the idols of Bodhisattvas and the Buddha for liberation, both of them happening parallelly, indicating that idol or image worship was growing at that time. So this was the third and the last part of your fourth chapter of Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings, which was from your first book of history, Themes in Indian History, class 12th NCERT. I hope you enjoyed the chapter, understood it. Again, history है, I cannot emphasize enough कि आप टाइमलाइन पे ध्यान दें, उस पे फोकस करें, और क्योंकि टाइमलाइन क्लियर रहेगी तो कॉन्सेप्ट्स अपने आप प्लेस में गिरने लगेंगे. वेरी इजी एंड बेसिक चैप्टर दिस वाज, just understanding the sculptures, art and carvings, etc. So we have reached the end of the chapter and I hope you understood everything in the same. Thank you, Team Educate.